The shovel bit into the Nebraska hillside for the first time on September 14th, 1873, and the talking started before the blade had cleared its second load of earth. Cal Brandt saw it from his wagon on the road above, slowed his team without meaning to, and watched for a full minute before his brain assembled what his eyes were reporting. A woman standing waist-deep in a hole she had apparently dug herself, wearing a cotton work shirt darkened at the back with sweat, her skirts gathered and tied with a length of rope at the knee. She was not digging a well. Wells went straight down and narrow. This hole was wider than any root cellar he had seen started, and she was throwing the excavated soil onto a growing pile behind her, with the mechanical rhythm of someone who had been at this for hours and intended to continue for hours more. He had homesteaded 2 claims before this one survived 2 Dakota winters that had taken men he respected, and he recognized purposeful labor when he saw it. What he could not identify was the purpose. He climbed down from the wagon, crossed the road, and walked to the edge of the excavation. The woman did not look up. "Ma'am." He tried the word like a key in an unfamiliar lock. She threw another shovelful. The soil arced and landed with a soft thud on the pile. "Ma'am, you're digging a grave, not a home." The shovel paused. Not because the words landed, he would understand that later, but because she was choosing her response the way a carpenter chooses a tool deliberately from a full collection. When she looked up, her eyes were the color of creek water in October gray-green, and measuring. "If I wanted your opinion on where to sleep, Mr. Brandt, I would have asked before I purchased the land." She drove the blade back into the earth. "But since you rode all this way, you might want to watch how a woman prepares for winter. You'll learn something." He stood at the edge of the hole for another 30 seconds. Then he walked back to his wagon, climbed up, and drove on. He would not admit until January that she had been right, and he had been wrong, and that the distance between those 2 facts had nearly killed him. Marta Voskova had arrived in Custer County 3 weeks before that September afternoon, and in those 3 weeks she had not driven a single stake into the ground or raised a single timber. Her nearest neighbors, those who had stopped to introduce themselves, which was most of them, because isolation made people sociable in ways that crowded cities never did, had watched her with the particular concern that frontier communities reserve for people who seem to be doing things incorrectly. They arrived at her wagon with food and opinions, usually in that order. She accepted the food. She absorbed the opinions without argument, which some people mistook for agreement, and which was not agreement at all. She was 42 years old. She had buried her husband 16 months earlier beside the Little Blue River in a grave marked with a cottonwood branch that would not outlast the first hard rain. Josef Voskova had died of cholera on the trail west from Iowa 3 days after the first symptoms appeared, 1 day after she had understood that the symptoms were not going to stop on their own. She had dug that grave alone in soil that was nothing like the loam they had farmed in Cedar Rapids, and she had filled it alone, and she had sat beside the mounded earth for an hour before she understood that sitting was not going to change anything, and that the wagon was not going to drive itself. They had planned this together, 160 acres under the Homestead Act. A fresh start after the Cedar Rapids farm had gone to debt 2 years before the drought that would have taken it anyway. Josef had been the better carpenter, the stronger, back the one who could talk a fair price from an unfair seller, with nothing but patience and goodwill. Marta had been the one who read soil, who understood water drainage and foundation angles, who had grown up watching her grandfather build and maintain structures that lasted because he understood something fundamental about the relationship between buildings and the ground beneath them. Her family had been among the first generation of their line born on American soil, the children and grandchildren of immigrants who had carried practical knowledge across the Atlantic, the way other people carried silver, as the one thing that could not be confiscated. Her grandfather had built a storage cellar under his barn in Pennsylvania and maintained it for 30 years. And the knowledge he had passed to Marta was not mystical or regional or dependent on any particular landscape. It was physics, and physics did not change when you crossed state lines. Now she was doing everything alone, which changed the mathematics of survival without changing the underlying principles. The quarter section she had filed on sat where the rolling prairie began its long climb toward the sandhills, 160 acres of grass that turned gold in September and the color of old bone by November. A creek ran year-round in the northwest corner. She had tested it 3 days in a row to confirm it was not seasonal, with a stand of dead and dying cottonwoods along the bank that would provide one category of fuel without costing her anything. The land rose from the creek in a long gradual slope until it met a ridge that blocked the north wind with the indifference of something that had been doing so for 10,000 years. Below the ridge, the south face of the hillside caught morning sun from first light until well past noon. That was where she was going to build. Not on the hilltop where her nearest neighbors had placed their sod houses to capture the view and the breeze, and where the wind struck every wall with equal and unrelenting force. Into the hillside, below the ridge, on the face that sun warmed and wind could not directly hit. She spent her first week on the claim not building, but reading. Every morning she rose before light and walked the full perimeter of her property, making notes in the water-stained ledger she had carried from Iowa. She recorded the direction and duration of every wind shift. She noted where standing water pooled after the single rainstorm that passed through in her first week, and where it drained, and how long it took to disappear. She walked the slope of the hill with a carpenter's level borrowed from her wagon kit, taking measurements at regular intervals, charting the angle of the ground. She found the frost line by pushing a steel rod into the soil at different depths and recording the temperature differential with a thermometer. She pressed against the rod at each depth. She did all of this methodically without hurry, because she understood that the house she was about to build would determine whether she lived through the next several years, and that a week of observation was a cheap price for that information. The neighbors who stopped to check on her during that first week found a woman standing in a field writing in a book. A few asked if she needed help. She thanked them and said she was fine. A few asked what she was writing. She said she was taking measurements. None of them asked what kind of measurements, which told us something about the nature of the knowledge she was working with. It was the kind that felt obvious once you had it and invisible before you did. The back half of Martha's wagon had been loaded with oak beams since she left Iowa, and for those first 3 weeks while she was surveying. And the beams sat under canvas. People had assumed they were fence posts or furniture components or building material she had misgauged in quantity. The beams were salvaged from the Cedar Rapids farm, the one thing she had dismantled and loaded before the creditors arrived to take everything else. They were already cut, already dried, already seasoned to the specific quality that structural oak achieved after years in a working farm's timber store. She had not taken them because she had a plan for them. She had taken them because they were hers, and because she understood in the way that people raised by careful builders understand that good structural wood was worth more than the weight of silver it would have required to replace. By the time Cal Brandt made his visit on that September afternoon, the excavation had been underway for 4 days. Martha had not started at dawn on the first day of digging. She had started at 10 in the morning after spending 2 hours with the level and the rod confirming what she already believed about the specific angle of the slope at the chosen site. She had marked the outline of the main room 20 feet long, 14 feet wide with stakes and string, and she had dug the first shovelful of earth with no ceremony and considerable effort, because the first foot of Nebraska prairie soil contains more tangled grass root than it contains anything else, and the only way through it is persistence. The excavation she was creating was not a root cellar and not a sod house, though it contained elements of both and was often mistaken for each in turn as different neighbors arrived to inspect and comment. The main room would sit 12 feet below the crest of the slope carved into the hillside, so that 3 of its 4 walls were solid earth. The 4th wall, the south-facing front, would be constructed from sod blocks 2 feet thick with a door, and a single window glazed with real glass she had hauled from Omaha, at a cost that made her stomach tighten when she thought about it. The roof would be log beams, willow branches, tar paper, and 18 inches of sod, which was standard construction for the terry tree, and worked well enough if the beams were strong and properly spaced. That was the part people could understand, because they had seen it before. The part they could not understand, the part that would save her life in January, lay beneath the floor. Clara Marsh arrived on a Wednesday in the third week of September, coming alone without her husband, Edwin carrying a cloth-wrapped loaf of cornbread still warm from the oven. She was a small, precise woman, with the particular attentiveness of someone who had learned that information was more useful than sympathy in most of the situations frontier life produced. She sat on the edge of the excavation with her feet dangling and watched Martha work for a while before she spoke. Edwin says you're building a root cellar that's too big to be useful and too small to live in. Edwin hasn't seen the plans. He's seen the hole. He says the spring melt will flood it. Martha set the shovel against the wall of the excavation and pulled her work gloves off. Come down here. Clara hesitated for only a moment, then climbed down the rough earthen steps Martha had cut into one end of the hole. She stood on the floor of the excavation and looked at the walls around her, the sky above the precise right angles Martha had maintained in the corners. Spring melt floods a space when drainage is wrong, Martha said. Drainage is not wrong here. You see this wall? She pointed to the earth on the western side of the excavation. I'm going to cut down another 4 feet along this entire edge. 20 feet long, 8 feet wide, 4 feet deeper than this floor. The floor of that lower chamber will slope toward a drain channel that runs through a clay pipe to the outside. The pipe exits 30 feet downhill far enough that gravity keeps water moving out and nothing runs back in. Clara looked at the ground for a moment, working through the geometry. That's your storage. For food. For firewood. There was a silence that contained surprise, recalculation, and the beginning of genuine interest. How much? 6 cords, 128 cubic feet each. The vault will hold them with room to move between stacks. I'll stack everything on rock platforms 6 inches off the floor, so if any moisture gets past the drainage, it does not touch the wood. Martha pulled her gloves back on. The ceiling of the vault is the floor of my house. The vault stays at whatever temperature the surrounding earth holds at that depth, which at this latitude in this soil is approximately 50 degrees year-round. Never freezing, never hot enough to dry the wood too fast and crack it. The wood stays exactly as it was when I put it in. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, where did you learn this? My grandfather. The words came without much weight, the way facts do when they are simply facts rather than performances of grief or pride. He kept a storage cellar under his barn in Pennsylvania for 30 years. Potatoes, carrots, turnips, apples, pulled them out in April, tasting like October. I watched him build it when I was 8 years old. I watched him maintain it for 20 years after that. He explained the physics to me when I was old enough to ask. She paused. He called it reading the earth. You pay attention to what the ground does naturally, and then you build with that instead of against it. Clara sat with this information for a moment. Then she looked at the cornbread she was still holding. I should have come without the food and with a notebook. Come back with both, Martha said. There's more to explain. Edwin Marsh arrived with his own notebook on a morning in late September, when the excavation had reached its final depth of 12 feet, and Martha was beginning to set the last of the vertical supports. He was a careful man, the kind who checked wagon axles twice before long trips, and kept written records of his planting dates. And he approached the site with the expression of someone who had already decided what he thought, but was willing to let the evidence argue its case. Mrs. Voskova. He stood at the rim and looked down at the work below. Those beams are oak. They are. You hauled oak beams from Iowa. They were part of our farm's timber store. I took them when the creditors took everything else. She did not elaborate on the word creditors or on the farm or on the word everything. Cottonwood rots underground in 3 years. Railroad ties absorb moisture. The oak will be here after both of us are gone. Edwin wrote something in his notebook. He was quiet for a moment then. I've built 3 structures in Nebraska territory. What you're doing there, the depth, the placement, that's not standard. Standard hasn't been tested against a hard winter yet, in my observation. Edwin looked at the support column nearest to him, the way the stones at its base were angled to carry water away, the way the horizontal bracing was cut to allow slight movement without structural compromise. You have engineering training. I have a grandfather who built things that lasted and explained to me why they lasted. Same thing sometimes. She looked up at him then. Are you here to tell me it won't work, or are you here to understand how it works? He held her gaze. I'm not sure yet. Come back when you've decided. I'll show you the drainage calculations. He did not come back that day or that week, but he came back eventually in the way that careful men with notebooks always come back to things they cannot stop thinking about. Sergeant Roy Decker arrived on an afternoon in early October when the main excavation was complete and Marta was beginning to line the Firewood vault walls with creek stones. He had served at Fort Kearny before mustering out and had the manner of a man who had spent years being professionally correct in situations where incorrectness had consequences. He stood at the edge of the excavation, looked down into it, and shook his head with the slow deliberateness of someone who wants to make sure the head shaking is visible to all parties. This is the most foolhardy thing I've seen since a private tried to ford the Platte in April flood. He addressed Marta's back since she was working inside the vault section and had not turned around. First hard freeze that earth contracts and cracks every support you've got. Then the whole thing comes down on your head. I've seen soldiers die in collapsed trenches. It's not a quick way to go. She continued working. The sound of stones being fitted against earth continued. Then from below, without any change in the pace of the work. Did those trenches have drainage channels cut to grade? A pause. They were military field fortifications. Did they have support columns placed on 6-foot centers with horizontal bracing? Another pause. They were dug in hours, not weeks. Did they use foundation stones placed for water deflection at the base of each vertical support? Silence from above. I thought not. The stone-fitting sound continued without interruption. You're comparing military earthworks dug by tired soldiers under fire to a structure I've been engineering for 3 weeks based on principles proven over 30 years of actual use. The trenches collapsed because they were built wrong. This won't collapse because it's built right. Those are different categories of outcome from different categories of preparation. Decker looked at Harlan Webb, who had ridden over with him and who was standing 2 feet away with the expression of a man who has just watched someone else step into a conversation and finds himself unable to help. Neither of them had a response that was going to improve their position. But I appreciate your concern, came the voice from below, carrying something that was not quite warmth but was not hostility either. It makes me feel like part of the community. They rode home without having said anything that mattered. Clara returned 3 more times before the first snow. She came with her notebook on the second visit, and with questions that demonstrated she had been thinking carefully about what Marta had explained the first time, which was the best indicator of serious engagement that Marta knew. On the third visit, the subject turned to money. Marta had bought 3 additional cords of hardwood from a man in Broken Bow who hauled loads down from the river country to the north, $40. This information had moved through the community with the speed that all financial information traveled on the frontier. And by the time it reached most ears, it had been framed as either recklessness or eccentricity, depending on the sympathies of the teller. Cal Brandt had heard it and shaken his head. Edwin Marsh had heard it and added it to his mental ledger of evidence about Marta's judgment position not yet determined. Edwin says you could have taken cottonwood from along the creek, Clara said. I will. The dead timber along the bank will give me part of what I need. Marta poured coffee into the single good cup and the chipped one and handed Clara the good one, as she did every time, because Clara was a guest and guests received the better cup. But cottonwood burns poorly. Low heat, high smoke leaves residue in the chimney pipe. I need it for shoulder season burning when the temperatures are not severe. For the hardwoods January and February, I need dense hardwood that burns hot and clean. And the $40 bought that. The $40 bought dry hardwood already cut to length, delivered to within a mile of my claim, which I then transported and stacked in the vault in 3 days. If I had tried to source that same quality of wood through any other means available to me in this county, it would have taken until November and cost me something I could not replace, which is time specifically in the window between fall survey completion and first hard ground. She held the chipped cup with both hands. The $40 was not extravagance. It was arithmetic. Clara wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up. Edwin does arithmetic. He didn't think of this. Edwin's arithmetic started from a different assumption. He assumed that the firewood storage problem had already been solved adequately by existing methods. Martha looked out the window which framed a rectangle of October sky the color of pewter. Most people solve problems they have seen solved before. The problem I was solving I had not seen solved correctly, so I had to start from the beginning. Clara closed her notebook, opened it, closed it again. I'm going to tell Edwin what you just said, and he's going to spend 3 days being annoyed, and then he's going to agree with you. That's a reasonable timeline. On the night of October the 28th, Martha installed the cast iron stove and fired it for the first time to verify the chimney drew correctly. She held a burning tallow scrap at the base of the pipe and watched the flame angle toward the drawer, which told her what she needed to know. She moved her bedroll in from the wagon that same night before the interior walls were finished, before she had any furniture beyond the chair and the stove and the ladder to the vault. The door was hung, the window had glass, the stove drew. Those were the 3 conditions she had required, and she had met them, and there was no reason to sleep in the wagon when the house was ready to receive her by any standard that actually mattered. She spent the following week on the interior finish, chinking every visible gap in the sod walls with clay-packed wet-dried grass fiber and a surface coat of clay over everything. She did this systematically, starting at the floor and working up, moving around the perimeter twice to catch what the first pass missed. The front sod wall she packed from both sides. The cut earth walls on the other 3 sides she faced with the thin boards salvaged from an abandoned claim, not for insulation, but for stability, because raw earthen walls in an interior space shed fine particles continuously, and she did not want to be breathing her walls all winter. The floor she compacted with the back of a spade until it was as hard as tile, then laid burlap sacking in the areas she would walk most frequently. She had also spent 3 evenings in October at the table with her ledger, working through the fuel calculations that would determine whether her planning was adequate or merely hopeful. Nebraska burned approximately 1 cord of wood per month during a typical winter. A cord measured 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, 8 feet long, 128 cubic feet of stacked wood. Her vault held 6 cords with room to access each stack without moving others. October through March was 6 months. 6 cords for 6 months meant no reserve. But she had purchased more than her dead timber estimate had required, because she had decided in August, before she even reached Nebraska, that no reserve was not an acceptable margin. She would have 7 months of fuel in a vault built for 6 months. Whatever the winter decided to do, she had made her arrangements accordingly. The first snow came on November 2nd, 6 inches overnight, arriving with the silence that characterized first snowfall and the whiteness that turned familiar landscape into territory requiring reorientation. Martha rose at dawn, stoked the stove, and then opened the trapdoor in her floor for the first time since stacking the last cord. The ladder was 12 rungs down. At the bottom, she held up the lantern and breathed in earth and oak and the specific quality of underground air that is neither fresh nor stale, but simply still the way air was before wind existed. She walked the length of the vault, holding the lantern at different heights, looking at the wood. It was precisely as she had stacked it. Not a log had shifted. The surface of the oak nearest the drainage wall showed no moisture. She pressed her palm flat against the wall stone and felt the temperature cool, stable, unhurried, the same temperature the earth had been holding in that place for longer than anyone on the surface had been alive. She took an armload of split wood and carried it up, loaded the stove, struck a match. The fire caught on the first attempt. No hesitation, no coaxing, no second match. She sat in the ladder-back chair and watched the stove's iron sides begin to tick and darken as they heated. The thermometer on the wall read 51 degrees when she had come in from outside. 40 minutes after lighting the stove, it read 64. She added 2 more logs. It climbed to 68 and held there. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the door frame read 24. She did the calculation she had already done in her ledger, but found she wanted to verify with the actual numbers from the actual fire. 3 logs consumed over 3 hours, maintaining 68 degrees against a 24-degree exterior. At that rate, accounting for the fact that the coldest weeks would require perhaps 30% more fuel to compensate for greater heat loss, 6 cores would carry her to April. She wrote the verified numbers in the ledger with a line under them. The calculation was correct. The drainage was correct. The wood was dry. The stove drew cleanly. Outside the prairie, wind moved over the top of her hill and kept going, finding nothing on the south face to catch and tear and test. And Marta Voskova sat in 68 degrees of earth-held warmth and thought about January. She did not know yet what January would bring. But she had the particular quality of calm that belongs to people who have done the work that needed doing before the crisis arrived to reveal whether they had. Outside Calbrandt's woodpile sat under canvas on the exposed north side of his claim, accumulating its first skim of ice, beginning the slow transformation from fuel to problem that would reach its conclusion in ways he had not yet imagined. December arrived in Custer County like a debt collector. Not loud, not dramatic, just present and relentless, and not interested in excuses. The temperature on the morning of December 8th registered 6 degrees at dawn, and the community absorbed this fact by continuing to function while quietly recalculating. Marta recorded it in her ledger alongside her fuel consumption for the previous week, half a cord every piece igniting on the first match, stove maintaining 63 degrees, against an exterior that had no patience for anything built without forethought. Her neighbors were making different calculations and arriving at different conclusions, and the gap between their conclusions and hers was beginning to manifest in small but measurable ways. Cordwood that had been stacked outside since October was now locked inside columns of ice that formed between the logs overnight and required a morning's work with a hatchet to loosen. Canvas covers that had seemed adequate in October were tearing in the wind. Men were burning green cottonwood because the dry wood they had set aside for the worst weeks was already half consumed by the effort of compensating for wet wood's inefficiency, and green cottonwood in a cast iron stove produced more smoke than heat and left a coating on chimney pipes that would cause its own problems before the season ended. Marta knew all of this not because anyone told her, but because she could smell it. On still mornings when the wind dropped entirely and the cold pressed down like a hand on the landscape, she could identify her neighbors' fires by the quality of their smoke. The pale, clean column from Edwin Marsh's claim to the northwest, where he was burning decent cordwood in a tight stove with a good draft. The dark rolling output from the Lindqvist claim to the east, where Lars and Anna and their 3 children, who had arrived from Minnesota in the spring, were burning whatever they had without particular discrimination. The smoke told the story of each household's preparation the way a doctor reads a pulse. She did not visit to tell them this. It was not her place to lecture people who had not asked to be lectured. And unsolicited, technical advice was received about as well as unsolicited personal advice, which was to say, it was received as an accusation dressed in helpfulness. She kept her observations in her ledger and waited for the winter to make its own arguments. The argument the winter made on December 26th was written in Harlan Webb's blood. He was a solidly built man in his late 40s who had homesteaded the claim to her east 3 years earlier and had survived those years through a combination of stubbornness and practical competence that he carried without boast. He had been neighborly to Martha in a gruff arm's-length way since her arrival, not among the visitors who had come to question her methods, but not among those who had come to learn either. He existed in the middle category of the frontier community, watchful, self-reliant, reserving judgment. He went out at 7 in the morning on December 26th to split the next day's fuel supply, which was the practical thing to do, getting ahead of consumption, keeping a working supply near the door. What he had not accounted for was what 2 weeks of temperature cycling between single digits and the low 20s did to a cord of hardwood stacked on exposed ground. The outer surface of each log had frozen and thawed and frozen again. And the cycles had made the wood simultaneously brittle and sleek, so that when the splitting maul struck at an angle instead of center, which happened even to experienced woodsmen, especially when fingers were half numb inside insufficient gloves, at 7 in the morning at 8 degrees below, the maul deflected and continued its arc, and the hand that had been steadying the log paid the price. 3 fingers of his right hand, not severed but crushed at the level of the second knuckle in a way that made the attending physician's decision straightforward and his prognosis simple. The tissue was dead, the bone was shattered, and a man who wanted to keep the rest of his hand needed those 3 portions of himself removed before infection made a larger claim. His wife wrapped the hand and activated the network that connected isolated homesteads across 5 miles of frozen grassland. And by 5 in the afternoon, Dr. Patterson had covered 40 miles on horseback and was operating by candlelight on the Webb kitchen table, with Harlan Webb biting a leather strap and his wife holding the lantern steady with both hands. The fingers came off at the first knuckle. Webb would live, but he would not grip an axe the same way again, and the hand that had built his claim and planted his fields and maintained the machinery that kept his family fed was permanently and irrevocably changed by the simple fact that he had not found a way to keep his firewood dry. Martha heard about it 2 days later from Clara. She recorded it in her ledger in the same section where she tracked her fuel consumption, not because fuel and fingers were related in any direct sense, but because they were both consequences of the same Nebraska winter. And the winter did not distinguish between a man's fuel supply and a man's body when both were left insufficiently protected. Cal Brandt came to her door on the evening of December 18th, before the Webb accident, before Christmas, before the worst of it. He had been burning through his fuel supply faster than projected. She could see this in the volume of smoke from his claim and in the frequency with which she had watched him making trips between his house and the woodpile on the exposed north face of his property. He knocked on her door at dusk with his hat in his hands and the steam from his breath making small clouds between them. $10 for a week's supply of dry wood. That was his first offer, stated without preamble. I don't have spare to sell. She was direct about it, not apologetic, because apology would have implied that the shortage was her failure rather than the outcome of correct planning. She had calculated for 6 cords, and she had 6 cords, and she had not calculated for selling portions of that reserve to neighbors who had not planned adequately. $15, his second offer, delivered with the slight increase in tension around his eyes that marked the moment when a man realizes the conversation is not going the way he expected. Still no. Then, because she was not cruel, and because turning away a neighbor in a Nebraska winter required something more than a flat refusal. Come spring, when the ground is workable again, come back to this door. I will show you exactly what I built and exactly how I built it, and you can put in your own vault before next October. That offer costs you nothing and will be worth more than the wood you're asking to buy tonight. He looked at her for a long time in the cold. The light from inside the dugout came through the window and fell across the snow between them in a warm yellow rectangle that seemed almost pointed in its implications. Spring's a long way off when you're burning green wood that smokes more than it heats. Then I suppose you'll have a great deal of time to think about how you want to build differently. She held his gaze steadily without heat. The offer stands. I'll be here. He put his hat back on and turned toward his horse, and she closed the door against the cold And that was December 18th. That conversation was the last one he would have that winter, in which he still had the option of refusing to learn what she was offering to teach. Christmas Eve brought temperatures that made the preceding week seem temperate. 18 below zero at sundown, 23 below on Christmas morning. The sky a hard pale blue that offered light without any of the warmth that light was supposed to imply. The sun rose and tracked its shallow winter arc and set without having changed the thermometer, reading by a measurable amount. Inside Martha's dugout, the morning began with the smell of bread. She had set the dough the night before and baked it in the hour after she loaded the stove at dawn. And it came out with the particular density and crust that a cast iron stove produced when managed correctly. She ate half a loaf at the table with black coffee, read 40 pages of the novel she had been working through since November, and spent the afternoon with her ledger doing projections on fuel consumption through March. Estimates of harvestable dead timber in spring notes toward the garden she intended to start in April on the south-facing slope just below the dugout entrance. The thermometer inside read 64 degrees at midday. Outside it read -23. The arithmetic between those two numbers, 87 degrees of differential produced by a correctly designed structure, burning dry wood at a sustainable rate, was the most consequential calculation she had made since September. And she wrote it in the ledger with a line under it. 40 miles of territory in every direction from her dugout that Christmas Day. Families were making different calculations. The Lindquist household spent Christmas burning a mixture of dried grass and buffalo chips, and the last of a cord of green cottonwood that produced smoke in volumes that made the air inside the house a negotiation between asphyxiation and temperature. Their youngest child, 4 years old, spent the night with her feet on her mother's stomach under every blanket the family owned, and her toes stayed numb until morning despite this, and her mother would spend the next 2 months watching those toes for signs of damage that would declare themselves slowly. Roy Decker had burned through his calculated reserve faster than he had calculated because his calculations had not accounted for the gap between what dry wood produces and what marginally seasoned wood produces when the mercury sits below zero for days at a stretch. By December 28th, he had 10 days of fuel remaining if the temperature moderated. If it did not moderate, 7. He spent Christmas Day taking inventory and arriving at projections he did not share with his wife. Edwin and Clara Marsh fared better than most. Edwin had built a covered wood storage shed in September with a roof reinforced against snow load. And while the wood inside was not as dry as Martha's vault wood, it was drier than anything stored under canvas or left fully exposed. They spent Christmas uncomfortably rather than dangerously, which placed them in the upper tier of the community's distribution of outcomes for that particular holiday. Edwin spent the afternoon in his own ledger, arriving at the same conclusion from the opposite direction. What he had done was not enough, and what Martha had done was. And the difference between those two states of affairs was a design decision he had dismissed in September as overcomplicated. He wrote this in his notebook, which was a practice he maintained, even for conclusions he found personally unflattering. He considered it useful to have a record of being wrong, so that the wrongness could not be quietly revised in memory into something more comfortable. The stillness arrived on the afternoon of January 14th. Martha noticed it at the creek 20 minutes into what should have been a routine water collection trip. She had set both buckets down on the ice shelf at the bank and was working the hole she kept open with a steel rod when the sensation registered, not heard, not seen, but felt, in the way that significant changes in atmospheric pressure are felt before they are understood. The wind had stopped, not moderated, stopped. The grass on the bank, which moved constantly throughout every waking hour of every Nebraska day she had experienced since September, was motionless. The cottonwood branches along the water hung without movement. The world was perfectly unnervingly still, and the sky to the northwest had taken on a color she had no prior experience with. A yellow-gray with a brownish tinge at the horizon, the color of old bruising, heavy and low. The temperature was 12 degrees, which was not remarkable for January. But the stillness changed the meaning of 12 degrees the way silence changes the meaning of words. She filled both buckets and carried them inside. Went back for 2 more. Then she pulled the trap door and carried up enough wood to fill the space beside the stove, completely more than a week's supply. She checked every water container she owned. The oak barrel from Iowa, the ceramic crocks from Omaha, the collection of tin pails. She filled every one from the water buckets and from 2 additional trips to the creek. Before the sky had darkened another shade towards something that had stopped resembling ordinary overcast. She inventoried her food: salt, pork, beans, flour, coffee, dried apples, 30 days at careful rationing. She checked the chimney drawer. She latched the window from inside. Then she sat in the ladderback chair and watched the sky through the glass. Snow began at 3 in the afternoon, as though it had been scheduled. Light at first, the ordinary-looking beginning that Nebraska winters had apparently decided to use as a standard deception, making each subsequent escalation seem more dramatic by contrast. By 4, it was heavier. By 5, the wind had returned, and it had not returned as the wind she knew from the preceding months. This was something categorically different. This wind had velocity she felt through the sod walls as a pressure change rather than a sound. And the sound it made was not wind on grass or wind on boards, but a sustained resonant note that sat at the edge of what the ear could identify as sound rather than sensation. Tam nin tu mo tam yard sung nam mui sung hai mui sung hong konzi. At 7 o'clock, she could not see the cottonwoods. At 8, she could not see the post 12 feet from her front wall. There was nothing outside her window but white motion, undifferentiated and total. The temperature outside 8 degrees at 5 o'clock, 0 at 6, -6 at 9, -12 at 10, -18 at 11, when she added 2 logs to the stove and watched the interior temperature, which had dropped to 57, as the wind found the microgaps every sod structure contained, climb back to 62 and hold. She plugged the gaps she could locate by touch with strips of wool cut from a coat she had decided could be sacrificed for this purpose. The temperature climbed to 63 and stayed there. The stove ticked in the orange dark. Outside, the storm expressed itself in terms that had moved beyond weather into something that seemed to have intentions. Roy Decker's chimney gave up on the storm's first night. The condensation that collected inside flue pipes during extended cold was a known problem. The temperature differential between the hot gases rising from the stove and the frozen pipe exterior producing moisture that froze on the interior walls and accumulated into a ring of ice that progressively narrowed the draw and eventually closed it entirely. By 10 o'clock on the night of January 14th, the draw in his stove dropped to nothing and the smoke began going elsewhere. The choice the smoke forced upon him was not complicated in its structure, only in its consequences. He opened a window on the south side of his house. The temperature inside dropped from 41 degrees to something below what his thermometer could measure at its lower end before it had finished dropping. He and his wife climbed into bed with every textile object in the house piled on top of them. Blankets, coats folded, curtains, spare clothing. A canvas tarp, and they lay still and breathed carefully in the manner of people who understand that stillness conserves warmth, and that warmth is the only available currency at this particular moment. They were still alive in the morning, which meant the balance had held but only just, and the word only was carrying significant weight in that equation. Clara Marsh stood inside her door in the dark of the storm's second night, with a rope coiled in both hands and the other end tied around her husband's waist, and she felt the rope go taut and then go slack, and then go taut again in a rhythm that told her he was moving. And then she felt it go taut and stay taut in a way that did not correspond to any rhythm. And she pulled hand over hand steady and without panic until the weight at the other end was inside the door, and Edwin was on the floor in front of her, with his face the color of the snow he had come back from, and his hands curled into shapes that hands did not naturally take. He had made it 15 feet from the door before the wind put him on the ground. He had not reached the woodshed. There was no wood coming in tonight. Clara pulled his boots off and held his feet against her stomach under her coat and waited for the color to come back into his toes. And when it did not come back as quickly as it should have, she made a decision about the spindle-back chair that had come from her mother's house in Ohio because it was the driest wood in the house. And because her mother, if she had been present, would have understood the arithmetic without needing it explained. The Lindqvist family had no such decisions available to them on the storm's second night. Lars had built a wood storage shed in October with a roof he had reinforced with extra poles. The roof held through the first night. The snow load that accumulated through 12 hours of horizontal driving accumulation, settling and compressing into a weight the structure had not been designed for, addressed the roof's integrity on the second afternoon, with a sound that the oldest son, 14 years old, would describe to his own children 40 years later as the loudest thing he ever heard that did not involve artillery. The shed was gone. The wood supply was under 8 feet of packed snow and structural debris. Lars stood inside his house and looked at what he had for heat, the remnants of the indoor supply, which would last another 6 hours at current burn rate, and made the calculation the situation required. His wife, Anna, who had come to Nebraska from Minnesota with 3 children, and the particular competence of a woman who had already survived winters that would have broken someone with less experience, began burning dried grass from the bundle she kept by the stove as supplement fuel. It burned fast and hot and produced almost no lasting heat, requiring constant feeding. But it was there, and it was dry, and it was keeping the temperature from dropping below freezing, which was the threshold below which the situation would change from dangerous to catastrophic. Marta used 9 logs during the 41 hours the storm lasted. Each one came up from the vault dry and clean and ready. Each one went into the stove without negotiation. The stove held 62 degrees through the worst of it, dropping to 58 once in the second night, when the wind found a new angle on the front wall, then climbing back when she added a half log beyond her usual measure. She slept both nights on her raised platform, woke each morning to a temperature in the low 60s, and a stove that needed stoking rather than restarting. She read 60 pages across the 2 days. She baked cornbread on the second morning. She recorded everything in her ledger with the date and the temperature and the fuel consumption, because data was only useful if you collected it. Even when collecting it felt redundant. When the wind dropped on the morning of January 16th, the silence that followed was not the stillness that had preceded the storm. That stillness had been a held breath. This was the silence of aftermath, larger, emptier, the kind that makes the sounds that remain more audible by contrast. A single crow calling somewhere to the east, the creak of a frozen cottonwood branch settling. She waited until noon before opening the door. The drift against the front wall was 3 feet deep at its highest point, less than she had prepared for, and less than every above-ground structure in the area would face on their accessible sides. She moved through it in 20 minutes with a flat spade, and then stood on top of the winter and looked at what the storm had built and rearranged across the landscape. Kalbrandt's property was altered in ways that would take a full accounting to measure. The woodpile on his north exposure, she could estimate its location but not its boundaries, was a shape in the general geography of snow that rose 8 feet at its center and spread 12 feet in either direction. And somewhere inside that shape was the fuel supply that had been, as of December 18th, the last resource standing between his family and the cold. He was standing in front of it when she reached him 40 minutes after emerging from her dugout, having moved across a landscape that required attention and effort to navigate. He was striking the ice formation with a pickaxe in the methodical way of a man who has been doing something long enough to know it is not working, and is continuing anyway, because stopping means confronting what the ineffectiveness implies. She stood at the edge of his property and watched him for a moment. "How much dry wood do you have left?" He stopped mid-swing. He did not turn around immediately. The question sat in the cold air between them, its answer already apparent to anyone who had been watching his smoke for the past 3 weeks. "None." The word came out flat and factual, stripped of whatever defensiveness or pride might have accompanied it in a different context. Heaven had dry wood in 3 weeks. He turned then, and the look on his face was not the look of a man asking for sympathy. It was the look of a man doing an inventory of a loss. Your family warm. She understood that he was asking about the concept of warmth as something that could still exist in the world after 41 hours of what had just happened. Warm enough not to die, he said. That's about all I can say. He turned back to the ice formation and raised the pickaxe, and she watched each impact produce a small breach that the surrounding compression immediately minimized. And she thought about the gap between what he had known in September and what he knew now, and about how much that gap had cost him, and about the fact that the cost had been paid in a currency that could not be refunded. Should have built what you built. Yes. She held the word simply without weight or pleasure, because it was true and it was late, and the truth being late did not make it less true. You should have. She turned back toward her dugout, leaving him to his pickaxe and his ice, and the crow called again somewhere to the east, and the temperature at noon on January 16th was 34 degrees below zero, and the storm was over, and what it had revealed would take months to fully account for and years to fully understand. The temperature stayed below zero until January 23rd, which meant the week following the storm was a week of survival maintenance rather than recovery. The community moved through this period with the focused quiet of people who have been through something large and are not yet ready to measure it. Martha spent those days checking on neighbors not with food or advice, but with presence which cost nothing and mattered more than most people acknowledged. She found Roy Decker with a chimney his son-in-law had spent 2 days clearing, and a face that had the quality of a man who has recently understood the distance between what he believed about himself and what the evidence suggested. She found Harlan Webb sitting at his kitchen table with his bandaged hand on a folded cloth, watching his son-in-law split wood through the window. Unable to help, which for a man who had built a working homestead alone for 3 years, was a specific category of injury that went beyond the fingers. She found the Lindqvist family redistributed Lars and his oldest son staying at the claim, working to excavate the wood supply, while Anna and the 3 younger children had accepted the Marshes' offer of their second room. Meaning 8 people in a space built for 4 navigating this arrangement, with the cheerful pragmatism of people who understand that alternatives exist on a spectrum from inconvenient to fatal. Edwin Marsh arrived on January 25th with his notebook and a pencil sharpened to a fine point, the particular expression of a man who has prepared himself for a conversation he finds difficult but professionally necessary. He stood at her door in the morning light and said without preamble, "I'd like to see the firewood storage if you're willing to show me." She opened the door wider and he came in, and she lifted the trap door and he followed her down the ladder into the vault. He spent 20 minutes below. He measured with his hands where he had no instruments. The span between support posts, the width of the drainage channel, the height of the rock platforms from the vault floor. He pressed his palm against the wall stone the same way she had pressed hers that first November night. He crouched and looked along the slope of the floor toward the drain outlet, sighting down the angle the way a carpenter sights down a board for straightness. He examined the ventilation notches cut into the beams, each one small enough to pass 2 fingers positioned on the upper face to allow humid air to rise and escape without creating cross ventilation that would introduce temperature instability. His questions throughout were the questions of someone learning rather than evaluating specific technical, free of the rhetorical edge that characterized questions asked for the purpose of finding fault. When he came back up, he stood in the center of the main room for a moment. Then, "I told you in September that this would fail." "You did. I was working from the wrong model." He said it the way he wrote things in his notebook, directly without inflection, designed to soften the statement for his own comfort. "I had seen root cellars fail, and I applied that experience to what you were building, without correctly accounting for the differences in construction and design. That was an error in reasoning, not just in conclusion." She looked at him steadily. This was a different category of admission than what Cal Brandt would eventually offer, and it deserved a different response. "The model you were working from was reasonable given what you had seen. The problem was the sample. The cellars you had seen fail were built to a different standard. You could not have known that from the outside. I could have asked more questions before I formed the opinion. Yes, she did not soften this because he was not asking her to soften it. You could have. He looked up from the notebook. I'm going to build one of these in spring, adapted for my site. I don't have your slope orientation on the east side, but there's a north-facing cut behind the barn that will work for the thermal mass principle, even if the solar exposure is different. He paused. I'd like to review the drainage calculations with you before I break ground. Come back in March. I'll have the ledger open. He left without ceremony, which was the appropriate way to leave after a conversation that had been substantive rather than social. She watched him walk back toward his claim with his notebook under his arm and thought about the gap between the man who had stood at the edge of her excavation in September and the man who had just spent 20 minutes in her vault with a pencil and a set of questions that were actually questions. And she thought the gap was larger than the winter that had created it. Roy Decker came 4 days after Edwin, unannounced in the mid-morning, when the sky was clear and the cold had moderated to 10 above, which after the previous weeks felt almost lenient. He did not ask to see the vault. He stood in the main room and looked at the walls and the ceiling, and the window with its intact glass and the stove with its clean-burning efficient draft, and he did not speak for a long time. Then, I told you it would collapse on your head, compared it to a military trench. He said it flatly, not performing remorse, simply stating a fact about himself that he wanted acknowledged before anything else could happen. I was wrong. Everything I said about structural integrity and collapse risk was wrong. I was applying a category of experience that didn't fit what you were building, and I didn't ask enough questions to know that before I opened my mouth. She waited. I don't usually say I was wrong. I'm saying it now because what you built is the reason 6 families in this county are still here. He looked at her directly, including mine. She nodded once because the acknowledgement was genuine and deserved acknowledgement in return. Are you going to build one? A pause that contained something she recognized as the last resistance of a man's pride before it yields to the evidence. Yes. Good. Come in April. We'll walk your site. Cal Brandt came 3 days later, on a morning when the temperature had finally climbed above zero for the first time in 2 weeks. He came without preparation, which was consistent with how he had operated throughout, direct, unmediated, arriving at conclusions through experience rather than anticipation. He stood inside her door and looked at the vault trapdoor in the floor. And she opened it, and he went down and he stood in the vault for a long time without speaking. When he came back up, he stood in the center of the main room, and his expression held the specific quality of a man reconfiguring a significant assumption. He had built things. He knew what good construction looked and felt like. He was standing inside the proof of what he had dismissed, and the proof was substantial and warm, and had been both those things without interruption through the worst storm he had experienced in a decade of Great Plains living. I was wrong about you. He said it to the room as much as to her, the way confessions are sometimes easier when addressed to the space rather than the person. September, October. I thought you were a stubborn woman who didn't understand what she was doing, who had come out here with ideas from somewhere else that wouldn't survive contact with Nebraska. He looked at her directly then. Turns out you understood exactly what you were doing, and I didn't. A pause. I'm sorry for what I said at the edge of that excavation. She had been thinking intermittently since September about what she would say when this moment arrived. She had decided sometime in November that she would not use it for anything other than what it was. Apology accepted. Then, because the moment was complete and what came after it mattered more than the moment itself. Are you going to build one this spring, or are you going to spend next December doing what you were doing when I found you on January 16th? Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but the antechamber to one. I'll build. Then, I'll need help with the drainage. Higher water table on my claim, more clay content. Higher water table changes the drainage calculations, but not the principle. The outlet needs to be further from the structure and the slope steeper to compensate for slower percolation through clay. She said this without hesitation because she had thought about his site specifically in October when she was refining her own calculations and had been carrying the solution for 3 months without a recipient for it. Come in April, we'll walk your site before you break ground. He left and the morning continued, and 4 degrees above zero felt like a direction. Clara Marsh came alone the following week with a different quality of purpose than her previous visits. Something more settled, more decided the way a person arrives at a destination rather than passing through. She had been thinking about Anna Lindqvist, about the 3 Lindqvist children who had spent 2 nights in temperatures below freezing inside their own home. About the bronchial inflammation Anna was now recovering from, the kind the territory's single doctor had described as likely to resolve, but not guaranteed to, which meant something specific when you were 40 miles from medical attention. Clara opened her notebook and said, "I want to understand this well enough to teach it to someone else. Not just to do it myself, to explain it, the way you explained it to me at the beginning." This was a different request from Edwin's, which had been technical, or Cal's, which had been practical. This was a request about transmission, about the difference between knowledge held and knowledge passed forward. "Sit down," Marta said, and she brought the ledger to the table and opened it to the pages, from September the first pages, where the measurements and observations from the initial survey were recorded in the neat compressed handwriting she had developed over years of keeping farm records in Iowa. And she began at the beginning. They sat together for 3 hours. Marta explained each decision in sequence, not just what she had done, but why, not just the outcome, but the reasoning connecting the site selection to the drainage design, to the ventilation calculation, to the fuel capacity estimate. Clara took notes with the focused attention she had always brought to these conversations. But now she was asking a different category of question. Not how deep or what ratio, but how would you explain this to someone who had never seen a frost line, who arrived in Nebraska in April with a wagon and a family, and 60 days before the ground froze, and no prior experience of what this kind of winter required? "You start with what they already know," Marta said. "Everyone who has a kitchen understands that a covered pot stays hot longer than an open one. Everyone who has slept outdoors understands that ground is warmer than air in winter. You are not teaching them new physics. You are helping them apply physics they already live with to a problem they have not framed correctly yet." Clara wrote this down with a line under it. "Then Edwin is going to build the vault, but he will build it for us. What I want to do is make sure the next family that comes to this county builds their own before their first winter, not after." She paused. The Lindqvists came in the spring. Nobody told them. There was nothing written down anywhere that said, before you do anything else, before you plant a seed or raise a wall, settle your fuel storage first, because everything else you build depends on surviving long enough to use it. Marta looked at the ledger open between them and thought about the difference between knowledge that existed and knowledge that was accessible, about the gap between what she knew and what the Lindqvist family had known when they arrived in April, with equipment and optimism, and no one to tell them where to begin. "The priority is wrong in how people think about building here," she said. "They think about shelter first, because shelter is what you can see. Walls, a roof, a door that closes against the wind. Fuel storage is invisible. It is underground or in a shed in the corner of the property, and because it is invisible, people address it last. But fuel is shelter in the only sense that matters when it is 40 below. A house without reliable fuel is not a house. It is a box you die in slightly more slowly." Clara's pencil moved without pause. When she finished writing, she looked at what she had written, and then she looked at Marta. "I'm going to write this out as a guide, not a technical manual, something that a family arriving in spring could read and understand. Something that explains the reasoning, not just the instructions." She paused. "Would you review it when I have drafted it? Bring it when it is ready." March arrived and the ground softened. and the community began its spring accounting. 7 families within a 5-mile radius broke ground on firewood vaults in the weeks between the thaw and planting season. Not because Martha had lobbied them or issued warnings or made any argument beyond the one the winter had already made on her behalf. They came to her in ones and twos with notebooks and questions and a quality of attention that had not been present in September. The attention of people who had been tested by something real and had identified the gap between their preparation and what the test required. Edwin Marsh broke ground on March 15th on the north face of the cut behind his barn, adapting the drainage design for his clay-heavy soil with a longer outlet pipe and a steeper channel slope, exactly as Martha had outlined. He kept his own notes on every modification, recording what he changed and why, building a record of his specific adaptation that was distinct from but traceable to the original design. Clara reviewed the plans before he broke ground and asked 3 questions he had not considered, 2 of which he subsequently incorporated. Calbrandt broke ground on April the 3rd after Martha had walked his site twice, and they had measured the water table depth together with a steel rod and a measuring tape, and recalculated the outlet positioning for his specific conditions. He worked without shortcuts, which surprised no one who knew him. When Calbrandt committed to a thing, he committed to it fully, and the commitment he had made in January when he stood in Martha's vault and understood what he had dismissed in September was the kind that did not admit of half measures. Wilhelm Schaefer, who farmed 3 miles to the southwest and had survived the January storm with what he described as more luck than engineering, built the most inventive adaptation of the group. He constructed his vault beneath the floor of his workshop in the main barn, accessible through a flush trapdoor in the workshop floor, so that the firewood supply was accessible from a space that was itself sheltered, meaning that in the worst conditions he could reach his fuel without going outside at all. He brought Martha to inspect it before he finished the drainage installation, and she identified a ventilation issue with the positioning of his air exchange notches, and he corrected it that afternoon without argument. Lars and Anna Lindqvist broke ground on April 20th after Anna had recovered sufficiently from the winter bronchitis to be involved in the planning. She approached the vault construction with a directness that suggested she had decided to never again place herself in a position where the outcome depended on a structure above ground that the weather could reach. Their vault was smaller than Martha's because their site did not offer the same slope orientation, but the principles were correct and the drainage was precise, and Lars, who had been a carpenter in Minnesota before he became a farmer, did the rock wall mortaring with a quality of craftsmanship that Martha assessed as superior to her own when she came to inspect it in May. Roy Decker broke ground in late April on the south side of his property, where a shallow rise gave him the slope orientation he needed. He built methodically and asked questions when he had them, which was more often than anyone who had heard his September pronouncements about collapsed trenches might have predicted. The finished vault was not elegant, but it was correct in the ways that determined function. And function was the only standard that mattered. Clara's written guide was completed that winter. 2 pages written in the plain instructional style of someone who understands that the reader has not arrived with prior assumptions and needs the reasoning before the instructions. She had asked Martha whether to include Martha's name, and Martha had said that names made things personal and personal things could be dismissed in ways that principles could not. And Clara had agreed and kept the guide without attribution. The guide was copied by hand by 4 different people that first year and distributed to newcomers arriving at the county land office. It did not solve every problem it addressed, but it changed the question that arriving families asked, from where do I build my house to what do I build first? And that change in question changed the sequence of decisions that followed from it. The winter of 1874 to 1875 was mild as Nebraska winters go. Temperatures that went below zero, only briefly snowfall heavy, but not record-setting storms lasting hours rather than days. Some people looked at this mild season and felt confirmed in a suspicion they had been too careful to voice during the spring building. that perhaps January 1874 had been exceptional, that the precautions taken in response were reasonable given the fear, but possibly calibrated to an outlier. They said this quietly because the people who had built vaults had done so with effort and money and conviction, and questioning the necessity after the fact had a particular social cost on the frontier that was best avoided. Martha recorded the mild winter in her ledger without editorial comment. She noted the temperature minimums, the fuel consumption, the condition of the vault in spring dry, structurally intact, the oak posts showing no signs of deterioration, the drainage functioning correctly through the freeze-thaw cycles of late February and March. She did not write anything about what would happen in the winter after this one, because she did not know, and speculation was not the purpose of the ledger. What happened in January 1876 was 6 days. The storm that arrived on the 4th of January and did not fully release the territory until the 10th was not a single event, but a sustained condition, temperature and wind and snow overlapping and reinforcing each other in the way that the worst systems did, each element amplifying the others rather than operating independently. The temperature reached 41 below zero on the morning of January 7th, a number that settled into the community's collective memory, the way certain numbers do not just as data, but as a marker of experience, a reference point for every subsequent assessment of severity. Cal Brandt was warm for all 6 days. His vault had been operational since the previous October, stocked with wood he had spent September and early October, cutting, splitting and stacking with an attention to density and access that reflected everything he had learned from the previous winter. His fire never went out. His family never reached for blankets that were insufficient. On the 3rd day of the storm, when the wind was at its worst and the temperature at its lowest, his wife made a pie from preserved apples because the stove was hot and reliable, and there was no reason not to. Edwin Marsh was warm. Clara was warm. Their children were warm. The vault Edwin had built behind the barn performed within 5% of Martha's design parameters, which he verified against the notes he had kept during construction and the observations he recorded during the storm. Because Edwin Marsh was the kind of man who kept records even during emergencies, perhaps, especially during emergencies. The Lindquist family was warm for the first time through a major storm in 3 years of Nebraska homesteading. Lars recorded this in a letter to his brother with a specificity that suggested he was aware of the significance, not just that they had survived, which they had done before, but that they had survived without cost, without injury, without the sustained low-grade crisis management that had characterized their previous 2 winters. The children slept normally. Anna's lungs, compromised by the previous winter's exposure, were not asked to compensate for cold that should not have reached them. Roy Decker was warm. His chimney did not freeze because he had installed an insulated chase around the exterior pipe section in October, a modification he had developed from studying the failure mode of the previous winter's collapse with the same methodical attention he had once applied to military logistics. He and his wife sat by the stove on the 6th day of the storm and played cards, which was not a thing he had any memory of doing during a Nebraska blizzard before. A family named Bauer, who had arrived in the territory in the spring of 1875, and who had been told about the vault design by 3 separate neighbors during their first summer, and had decided the construction season was too busy to add the excavation to their work list, lost their entire wood supply when their shed collapsed under snow load on the 2nd day of the storm. They survived because their neighbors were prepared this time, and the network of obligation and assistance that connected the community had been strengthened by the experience of 1874. But they spent 4 days of the storm burning furniture and borrowed fuel, and in the spring, they broke ground before they planted a single seed. By 1877, the principle had traveled beyond the boundaries of what any one person had carried it. Homesteaders in Buffalo County, Dawson County, Valley County had heard about the underground storage design from people who had heard it from people who had been in Custer County in the winter of 1874. The transmission was not perfect. In some retellings, the technical details had been simplified or altered in ways that reduced the design's effectiveness. Marta heard occasional reports of vaults built without adequate drainage or with cottonwood posts instead of hardwood, and which had subsequently failed in the ways that inadequate drainage and cottonwood posts produced. But the core principle had traveled. Get the fuel underground, maintain access in the worst conditions. Let the earth do the temperature management that no above-ground structure could reliably perform. Marta lived in the dugout until 1884, keeping her ledger through every season, recording fuel consumption and temperature differentials and vault conditions with the same handwriting and annotation style she had used since September 1873. She was not building a monument. She was keeping a record, which was a different thing. Smaller, more honest, less concerned with posterity, and more concerned with accuracy. In 1884, she married Robert Calloway, a widower, with a larger homestead 8 miles to the north, and moved to his property. She kept her original claim, leasing it to a couple from Ohio named Harmon, who arrived with 2 children and a clear-eyed practical intelligence that had been shaped by reading Clara's guide before they filed their homestead papers. They built their own vault in the first summer and sent Marta a letter at the end of the second winter, saying that the vault had performed exactly as described, that the drainage had handled the spring melt without incident, that the oak post she had set 11 years earlier was sound and showed no sign of requiring replacement, and that they had named their second daughter Marta. She read this in Robert Calloway's kitchen and set it down on the table and did not remark upon it, though Robert noticed the expression that crossed her face and understood enough about her to leave it alone. In 1903, the family that had purchased the claim from the Harmons built a frame house with milled lumber and a coal furnace and filled the dugout with soil and planted the slope with winter wheat, and the wheat grew over the filled earth as though the structure beneath it had never existed. The summer of 1957 arrived on the former Voskova claim in the form of a John Deere tractor, and a man named Douglas, who was doing his 4th pass across the slope with a deep plow when the rear wheel dropped into something that was not soil behaving normally. He killed the engine and climbed down and found a void beneath a thin remaining layer of earth, a cavity 4 feet deep and approximately 8 feet across, its walls still lined with creek stones, its ceiling supported by oak beams that had been in the ground for 84 years and had not failed. He lowered himself into the cavity with a flashlight and stood in the underground air, which smelled of earth and mineral and something faintly dry and wooden that he could not immediately identify, and then did. And the identification produced a moment of stillness in him that he would struggle to describe afterward. The rock walls were intact. The floor slope was visible. You could see the drainage channel cut at its base running toward the outlet pipe, which was still present as a clay cylinder disappearing through the south wall. The oak post stood without visible rot or structural compromise. Whoever had built this had built it correctly, and correctly turned out to mean still standing after more than 8 decades of Nebraska winters. He took photographs with the Brownie camera he kept in the tractor cab for documenting fieldwork. 6 exposures from different angles, moving the flashlight to illuminate different portions of the structure. He climbed back out, covered the opening with boards, and drove back to the farmhouse. That evening, he spread the photographs on the kitchen table, and his grandfather, 79 years old, born in Custer County, in 1878, sat down and looked at them for a long time without speaking. He picked up the photograph that showed the oak beams most clearly and turned it toward the lamp. "That's Marta Calloway's work." He set the photograph down. "I was a boy when she died, maybe 7, 8 years old. She came to church in Broken Bow until she couldn't walk well enough to make the trip. Sat in the 3rd pew on the left, same seat every Sunday." He looked at the photograph again. "Smartest person I ever knew. Man or woman, schooled or not. She understood things about how the earth works, how structures work that people with engineering degrees were still figuring out 20 years later." He paused. "I heard her explain the thermal properties of subsoil to a county extension agent who had come out to advise homesteaders on construction. He had a university certificate on his wall. She had a ledger full of 20 years of measurements. She was more right than he was. Douglas filled the cavity the next day. He could not leave a void in a working field, but he kept the photographs. He put them in the wooden box where he kept the documents that mattered his father's land. Did his mother's letters, the survey map of the original homestead boundaries, the photographs of the oak beams and the stone walls and the drainage channel that had outlasted every wood frame structure built on the same claim in the same decade. His grandson still has them. 6 faded exposures, black and white, the flashlight making pale circles on surfaces that had held their integrity through the terms imposed by more than 80 winters. The dugout is gone. The wheat grows over it without interruption. Marta Voskova has been dead for more than a century, and most people in the county could not identify her if asked. But the vault stood until the plow found it, and the families who built their own version of it were warm in winters that killed the unprepared. And their children were warm, and their grandchildren built houses with furnaces and cold deliveries, and did not need to think about frost lines or drainage slopes, or the temperature of subsoil at depth, because those problems had been solved for them by systems they never examined and people they never knew. The oak beams stood for 84 years. That is the number that matters, not the mockery of September, not the vindication of January, not the apologies that came after. The beams, the drainage channel still carrying water away from wood that no longer needed protecting. The stones fitted by hand into walls that outlasted the hands that fitted them. Marta Voskova dug a hole in the ground and kept her firewood dry, and the ground held its temperature, and the wood stayed ready. And when the worst came, as the worst always came, as it comes to everyone eventually, the structure she had made from careful reasoning and patient labor held exactly as she had calculated it would.